Okay, so this house was built in 1868. The Moore family didn't move in until 1903. So they only lived here for 9 years before the whole family and two girls that they had spending the nights all were killed with the family's own axe while they slept. On June 9th, 1912, they all went to a church service about 3 blocks up the road. And while the Moore children were playing with Ina and Lena Stillinger, they asked if they would just spend the night here instead of staying with their grandma like they originally planned. So, unfortunately, the two girls were just here wrong place, wrong time. They had never stayed with the family before. That night, they all walked home together at about 10 p.m., so we assume they just went straight to bed. But the whole family slept upstairs because they would often rent the downstairs bedroom out to people working in town for the week. So that was their guest room, it was also their sewing room, but that's where Ina and Lena both shared the bed that night. And the next morning, the neighbor right next door, Mary Peckham, she was the first to notice that something was off over here, and she was very close with the family. She knew that they were up at about 5 o'clock in the morning to take care of their chores. So she came over and tried knocking and calling out, but wasn't getting a response. So she called Joe Moore's brother, and Ross came down and found a skeleton key to the parlor room door. He walks in by himself because Mary had a bad feeling. She just waited out on the porch. But he went into Ina and Lena's room first, where he discovered the two bodies covered up with sheets. He didn't know who they were. He just saw bloodstains and instantly knew that something was wrong. So he ran out and told Mary to call the doctor and the marshal. But that ended up being a citywide call, and there was over 100 people that went inside before the police could even get here. And everybody was passing around the axe, touching everything in the house, touching the victims. People were even taking home bone fragments of the victims as like souvenirs. It wasn't until about 10 o'clock in the morning when they finally secured the house, but they had to have the National Guard come here to help because once they started to turn people away, they were making their way in through the windows. So they had a barrier of men all linking arms around the house until they could finally put up barbed wires to keep everybody out. But some pieces of evidence that they found when they finally got here was all of the windows and all of the mirrors in the house were covered up with pieces of clothing or sheets. There's a yardstick propped up in the corner of Ina and Lena's doorway, and that's where the axe was left leaning up against the wall. And on the floor in front of the girls' bed, there was a slab of raw bacon wrapped up in cheesecloth. And there were many theories as to why the bacon might have been found in there, but we know that the mother cured her own bacon and would have used the downstairs closet for the curing process. So we think that while the killer was in there looking for things to cover everything with, that it might have just got drug out a bit, which it's hard to know what exactly was where before half the town came in, but they still thought that was an odd piece of evidence. And Ina and Lena were the only ones that appeared to be moved after. Not a whole lot of people knew that the girls were coming to spend the night that night, and they were unidentifiable when the police got here. So the only way they really had to identify them that morning was their names were written in their Bibles next to their bed, until their mother tried to call the house trying to find out where they were, and the operator was the one to inform her that everybody in the house had been killed and she wasn't able to place any calls here. But they found out that the killer went into the kitchen after to rinse his hands off in a bowl of water by the back door. He then cooked a meal, plated it, and sat it at the table, but it was left untouched. Obviously, still hung out for quite a bit to cover everything and cook a full meal, but it clearly wasn't a robbery of any kind. A lot of people thought it might have been a homeless man or a traveling serial killer, but you'd think maybe he would have at least eaten the meal he made or taken food or money with him, but no belongings were taken, and even Joe's wallet was left full of cash on his bedside table. The first room at the top of the stairs is where the parents slept, and Sarah was closest to the wall. Joe was on the edge of the bed, but Sarah was the only one out of all of the victims to be hit with the sharp edge of the axe. The rest were all hit with the hammer end of it. And Joe was hit over 30 times. We think it's just because he was the biggest threat, being the only man in the house. But even Sarah and everybody else was hit at least 15 times. Above the mirror in the parents' room, there's an indent from the sharp edge of the axe. And you can tell on the ceiling in that room where they've had to repair that because that was all marked up as well. But then straight through the parents' closet is the attic, and that's where they think the killer might have been hiding if he was already in the house when they came home that night. They found 2 cigarette butts in there. Besides that, it was the only evidence they had on somebody being in there, which we're completely unsure if he was already in the house or not, what time it took place, what victims were first or last. But they estimated it between midnight and 5 a.m., and either way, we assume it was the parents first. But they only used the attic for some storage. They definitely weren't looking in there before bed. You guys can go in there if you want to. Just please watch your head going in, and there's a lot of nails in the ceiling just to look out for. But the last bedroom is where all 4 of the Moore children slept. Their youngest son was 5. He had a bed in the crib area, and their other 2 sons shared the bed right in front of the window. They were 11 and 7. And then their only daughter, Catherine, had the bigger bed back in the corner, and she was 10 years old. There is a couple of little marks above the bed in front of the window that were also from the back swing, but that's how they found out whoever it was left-handed, because it was going up that way. And you can kind of tell on the ceiling in that room where they've had to repair some spots too. But they didn't get permission to start removing their bodies until midnight that night, so they were here all day, and it had taken them over 5 hours to finally get everybody removed from the house. They had their funeral in the town square that Wednesday, and over 7,000 people came to town for their funeral. All of the victims are buried up in the Villisca cemetery, which is also really cool to check out. But unfortunately, nobody was ever caught for the crime, and back then Villisca had night watchmen. Nobody saw or heard anything, and even all of the victims were lying in bed as if nobody in the house had woken up. Everybody in town was a suspect at one point, but the only man that was ever tried for it was the Reverend George Kelly. And he was a traveling reverend. He wasn't from around here, but he was at the same church service the night before, stayed in town that night, but left on a train at 5 a.m. and was already talking about it before they were discovered. And he was telling people there were 8 souls left back in Villisca, and that everybody should pity the killer because he had no control of himself. He sent bloody clothing off to be dry cleaned. He was left-handed. So many red flags, but they didn't arrest him until 5 years later. He was a schizophrenic and spent a lot of his life in and out of mental hospitals. So when he was being tried, he even confessed to it at one point. But because of his mental history, they didn't take anything he said seriously. He was only 5'2", 120 pounds. They didn't think somebody that size could commit a crime like this, but he even had Ina and Lena's parents defending him in court. So they fully acquitted him of all charges, and because nobody was ever convicted, they still rule it unsolved, which we will never 100% exactly know what happened in here that night. But in the Reverend's confession, he said that he followed a shadow man to the back of the family's yard who handed him their axe. It said, "Rise, slay, and eat." So he said he took the axe and walked right in the back door, but went off of the 3 words and said that he climbed up the stairs as Rise, killed everybody as Slay, then went into the kitchen and made the meal as Eat. And then after that wanted to take a nap, and that's when he discovered Ina and Lena downstairs. So coming from a reverend with schizophrenia, that kind of made sense. The shadow man, Rise, slay, and eat is a biblical term, his reasoning for everything. But even the covering of the mirrors, we know during that time period they would cover mirrors at funerals, but we also know that schizophrenics don't like to look at themselves in the mirror, so that possibly could have been the reason. Like I said, he even confessed to it, but unfortunately neither of the families ever got the proper justice because they thought he was just crazy, or they didn't think a reverend could possibly do it. Do you guys have any questions about anything? Yes?
What color was
What color was the house?
no, what color was the dog?
Oh, he was white. He was white. Well, we don't know exactly who did it, but the Reverend was white. And he had red hair. He was only about 35 at the time this happened. And after the trial, he changed his name. He was kind of hard to track down, but we found out that he died in New York at about 80. So he got to live the rest of his life. Nothing ever came about with him.